In the years after the war, when New York was feeding millions of people every single day, the most important roads in the city were not the ones tourists saw. They were the delivery routes before dawn, the ones that ran from warehouses in the Bronx, Harlem, and the West Side down into butcher shops, hotels, restaurants, and the wholesale markets that kept the city going. Those trucks carried beef, pork, poultry, and everything else a growing city needed. To most people, they looked like normal deliveries. To the men who understood how the city worked, those trucks represented something else. They represented control. Not loud control, not violent control. Quiet control through routine. The meat business did not look like a racket because it looked like work. Every load had to move before sunrise. Every order had to be filled on time. Every butcher expected his delivery before the crowds came in. The companies that owned the trucks depended on drivers who showed up at 3 in the morning, loaders who worked fast without questions, and foremen who kept schedules tighter than clocks. When a business depends on schedules and manpower, someone always sees a way to steer that business without anyone in the neighborhood understanding how it happened. That was the opening. Not a dramatic one, a practical one. They did not need guns. They did not need headlines. They just needed the roots. If you love stories about power, control, corruption, and quiet empires built in plain sight, make sure to follow, because this one ends where nobody expected it to. New York City, early 1950s. The city was expanding fast. War demand had made the meatpacking district one of the busiest industrial zones in the country. The wholesale markets in the Bronx and Manhattan ran night and day. Trucks lined up along 10th Avenue, West 14th Street, and the blocks near the old Gansevoort Market. Most of the workers came from neighborhoods where a steady job meant everything. A man started loading meat because someone in the family had done it before him. He stayed because the work paid better than factories, and because the foreman treated the job like a trade. He understood the weight of each cut, the timing of each route, and the importance of not falling behind. That kind of work-world discipline attracted the Genovese family long before anyone ever said the words organized influence out loud. The family already had connections in trucking. They had ties to Teamsters locals that covered the docks, the produce market, and the fish market. The meat industry used many of the same hands. Drivers moved between different kinds of freight. Loaders did the same. If a man could handle a pallet of fish at dawn, he could handle a refrigerated side of beef. Union lists, seniority rules, and labor crews created natural choke points. When a business depends on who gets the route, who gets overtime, and who keeps the peace, influence builds itself. That was the world Anthony Salerno grew up around. In the early 50s, Salerno was not yet a front boss or a public name. He was a rising Genovese associate based in East Harlem. He ran gambling operations, loan businesses, and had steady relationships with small companies that needed protection from disputes. His early life revolved around numbers, work crews, and the kind of neighborhood businessmen who stayed afloat by understanding the traffic of the city. Those experiences shaped him. He learned early that steady systems made steady money. The meat routes were a steady system. He had spent his younger years around garages, bookmakers, and men who worked irregular hours. Those same men often had brothers, cousins, or neighbors who drove night routes for meatpacking companies. Salerno did not step into the industry because of power. He stepped into it because the people he knew were already part of it. A driver would mention his company losing money from delays. A loader would say the foreman listened to the wrong men. A warehouse owner would complain that a rival distributor was undercutting prices. To most people, these were small problems. To Salerno, they were signals. His early influence started with a simple favor. A driver on a Bronx route kept losing hours because another crew refused to load his truck on time. Someone asked Salerno if he knew anyone who could smooth things out. He made a call. A meeting was held. No threats, no noise. Just a reminder that everyone did better when the schedules stayed steady. The next night, the truck was loaded on time. A week later, the foreman seemed more cooperative. A month later, the company was moving its orders faster than ever. Small favors built quiet respect. By 1954, Salerno understood the map of the city's meat routes better than most of the men who worked inside it. He knew which companies controlled the biggest orders. He knew which markets had the most traffic. He knew which foremen could be trusted and which ones needed direction. He saw that the trucking companies operated on thin margins. If a truck was late, the butcher complained. The butcher complained, the company paid. A late delivery cost money. A missed delivery cost accounts. Stability became the most valuable currency. Salerno did not push his way into the business. He built trust the same way he always had. He listened. He offered solutions. He stayed one step behind the men who officially ran the operations. A warehouse owner complained about a rival undercutting him. Salerno arranged a conversation that ended the problem. A driver wanted a steadier overtime schedule. Salerno mentioned his name to a steward. A butcher wanted more reliable delivery windows. Salerno knew someone who could help. Nothing looked like crime. It looked like organization. This part comes from Senate committee testimony in later years. Several witnesses described how trucking routes connected to the meat markets tended to follow patterns tied to familiar names. Those names were often connected to the Genovese family, not through violence, through consistency. A driver who caused trouble found himself reassigned. A company that tried to step outside the quiet arrangements found its trucks waiting longer at loading docks. The system responded without ever raising its voice. By the mid-50s, Salerno had become a quiet anchor behind some of the most reliable meat routes in the city. He was not the only influence. Other families had small corners. The Gambinos had ties to certain labor pockets. The Lucchese's had contacts in manufacturing and produce. But the Genovese family, through Salerno's steady work, held the main arteries that mattered. The money did not come in large piles. It came from regularity. A small piece from each load. A quiet payment from a company that wanted no delays. A steady contribution from drivers who appreciated predictability. Across hundreds of deliveries a week, it added up. Nothing big enough to call attention. Nothing sloppy enough to leave traces. By 1958, Salerno's influence in the trucking world was respected inside the family. He was known for keeping disputes from becoming problems. He understood that the goal was not to dominate the industry. The goal was to stabilize it. The more predictable the system became, the more valuable it became. The routes ran like a machine because the machine had an engineer. And that engineer never needed to step into the light. By the start of the 1960s, the structure of the meat trucking network was set. To the public, it looked like nothing more than trucks running before dawn. Workers unloading sides of beef, drivers checking clipboards. Foremen shouting instructions to keep the morning moving. No one outside the business ever thought there was anything more to it. But inside the industry, the people who mattered knew that the same crews ran the same routes for the same companies, and the same quiet influence shaped decisions that kept the city supplied every single day. The power never sat with the companies themselves. It sat with the men who kept the labor steady. If a warehouse wanted an extra truck at 4 in the morning, a phone call handled it. If a butcher needed a delivery held back for an hour, another call handled it. None of those calls were made by Salerno directly. They were made by men who trusted the way he kept order. That was how the system ran, not through fear, through familiarity. A man listened because he knew the person giving direction understood the job. Broadway had its backstage lists. The meatpacking district had its routes. Each route had drivers who preferred the same foreman. Each foreman had loaders he trusted. Those loaders had helpers they relied on. When a system functions through relationships instead of paperwork, influence sits in the relationships. Salerno made sure those relationships stayed predictable. He had learned early that speed was everything in the meat business. Cold storage rooms could only hold so much. Trucks had to be on the road before the sun rose. Delays cost money. Arguments on the loading docks slowed everything down. Salerno focused on eliminating disruptions. If a worker caused trouble, he was replaced quietly. If a company complained about a driver, someone else was assigned. If a foreman tried to cut corners, he was reminded how thin the margins were. Nothing needed threats. A simple shift in routine was enough to send a message. This part comes from old federal records. Investigators later noted that certain companies received priority docking positions at the markets. Their trucks were unloaded first. Their drivers rarely waited. No official rule gave them that privilege. It happened because the men working the docks moved them to the front, and those men answered to familiar voices. Investigators called it informal advantage. The workers called it respect. By 1962, Salerno had built a network of small trucking outfits that relied on him more than they relied on their own owners. A dispatcher faced with too many orders would call a contact connected to Salerno. A warehouse that needed extra nighttime workers would ask for recommendations. None of this looked unusual. It looked like the way business was done. That was the strength of the system. It blended into ordinary life. Salerno did not care about fame. He cared about flow. And the flow was steady. Throughout the 60s, New York changed. Paris construction surged. Tourism grew. Immigration increased. Restaurants expanded. Hotels upgraded their kitchens. All of it required meat. And that meant more trucks, more drivers, more warehouses, and more routes. Each new customer made the network more valuable. But as demand increased, so did competition. Some companies tried to cut into established routes by underpricing deliveries. They offered faster service, lower rates, or new trucks. On paper, they looked like legitimate threats. Salerno dealt with them by tightening reliability on his side. If a competitor tried to take accounts, the established routes simply worked better. Trucks arrived earlier. Deliveries were more accurate. Workers showed up on time. Problems were resolved before customers noticed. A butcher making a choice between two companies usually went with whatever caused fewer headaches. Salerno made sure his side caused no headaches. Other families tried to enter parts of the business. The Gambinos had ties to distributors in Brooklyn. The Lucases had contacts in produce and transportation. The Colombo family had some reach in small trucking firms. But none of them matched the Genovese family's influence in the meat routes. Salerno's steady presence maintained that advantage. He never acted like he controlled the city. He acted like he understood how the city worked. By the mid-60s, the routes ran like a machine. The same trucks rolled out of the Bronx yards at 3 in the morning. The same drivers crossed the same bridges. The same foreman sent the same men to the docks. Every stop had its order. Every schedule had its rhythm, and the money moved the same way. Little from each company for stability. A little from each accident avoided. A little from each route kept on schedule. It was never about squeezing people. It was about keeping things smooth. Smooth systems stay profitable. By 1967, the operation had reached its peak. Several markets across Manhattan and the Bronx leaned on the same labor channels. Companies made quiet payments to ensure no delays. Drivers worked steady hours. Foremen sent envelopes up the chain. No one made large sums. Everyone made reliable sums. That was the difference between a loud racket and a quiet one. Quiet rackets last longer. The value of the routes grew when the city modernized its refrigeration laws. New York required better insulated trucks, newer equipment, and regular maintenance checks. Smaller companies could not keep up. Salerno made sure that companies within his reach stayed compliant. Drivers received proper equipment. Repairs were handled quickly. Trucks stayed on the road. This gave Salerno's network more strength. When others struggled, his crews met the new standards without falling behind. The central figure in this period, Salerno, never presented himself as anything more than a businessman connected to the neighborhoods. Workers saw him as someone who helped them keep their jobs steady. Company owners saw him as someone who solved problems. Men inside the family saw him as someone who understood the value of labor. Everyone saw something different, and that was the reason his influence held. But by the late 60s, small changes signaled a shift. Younger drivers wanted more independence. New owners wanted cleaner books. Regulatory agencies began inspecting trucking companies more closely. The city pushed for standardized routes and tested new distribution methods. Some warehouses automated paperwork. The changes were small at first, but they reflected a larger shift in the city's economy. Competition increased. Large corporate distributors entered the market. National chains moved into the food business. They brought their own trucks, their own systems, and their own policies. They hired managers who had never worked with the old networks. The personal relationships that once held everything together mattered less. By 1969, the first cracks appeared. A major company switched to corporate distribution. Another brought in outside logistics consultants. Smaller butchers began ordering from out-of-state suppliers. The city was growing, but it was growing in a direction that did not depend on the old ways. Salerno saw the change before most people did. He knew that influence over labor mattered only when labor controlled the work. Technology and corporate policy were beginning to take that control away. He did not fight the shift. He adjusted. A man who survives decades in the city understands when the tide moves. As the 70s approached, the system that once ran like a machine began to lose its grip. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just slowly, the way old methods fade when new ones take their place. But the men who lived through the years when every meat truck in New York passed through quiet channels remembered. They remembered the steady rhythm. They remembered the familiar names. They remembered when the Genovese family guided the routes without raising a voice. And they remembered the man who kept it all steady.